All right, everybody. Well, I'd like to get started. Welcome to our Pastoral Forum this evening. My name is Chris. If we don't know each other, thanks for being here tonight. What I'd like to do is we're gonna start the evening with some singing. We're gonna end the evening with some singing. But I'd like to read to you Romans 14. Verses 7 and 8, which is where the song we're about to sing comes from. It says, "For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's." Our only hope in life and death is Christ alone. And so we sang it this morning. I'd like to sing it again this evening. Why don't you stand and we'll lift our voice together. What is our hope in life and death? Christ alone, Christ alone. What is our only confidence? That our souls to him belong, who holds our days within his hands. What comes apart from his command, and what will keep us to the end? The love of Christ in which we stand. Oh, sing hallelujah, our hope springs eternal. Oh, sing hallelujah, now and ever we confess Christ our hope in life and death. What truth can calm the troubled soul? God is good, God is good. Where is his grace and goodness known? In our great Redeemer's blood, who holds our faith when fears arise, who stands above the stormy trial, who sends the waves that bring us nigh unto the shore, the rock of Christ. Oh, sing hallelujah, our hope springs eternal. Oh, sing hallelujah, now and ever we confess Christ our hope in life and death. Unto the grave, what shall we sing? Christ he lives, Christ he lives. And what reward will heaven bring? Everlasting life with him. There we will rise to meet the Lord. Then sin and death will be destroyed, and we will feast in endless joy when Christ is ours forevermore. Oh, sing hallelujah, our hope springs eternal. Oh, sing hallelujah, now and ever we confess Christ our hope in life and death. Oh, sing hallelujah, our hope springs eternal. Oh, sing hallelujah, now and ever we confess Christ our hope in life and death. Now and ever we confess Christ our hope in life and death.
All All right, well, you may be seated. We just wanted to say thank you for joining us tonight. We're so glad that you are here. Pastor Bob is going to come up in a couple of minutes to share with you. So if you didn't get a flyer, a little outline, there is one in the back. If you raise your hand, we'll make sure you get one. If you didn't get one of those, 2 up here, and 3. And so we'll make sure you get some of those. And then also a little housekeeping thing, the coffee's decaf. For just whoever needs that. I'm just saying, you can drink. Raise your hands if you need a little outline. All right, there, not coffee. I mean coffee too. All right, and there's some up here too, Joey. All right. So we'll make sure everyone has those, and then we'll get started. I know a subject like this can often be difficult to talk about. It'll stir up some feelings within our own hearts, some that we don't even realize are there. But would you allow me to pray for us tonight as we navigate through this together? Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we just come before you with our hearts just ready to receive what you have for us. Would you, Lord, remind us of your goodness and of the hope that we do indeed have in you through the blood of Jesus Christ, that our future is secure, that our life is secure in you. Would you help us as we navigate making good decisions and being good stewards of the life that you have given us here on earth? Be with Pastor Bob as he shares with us, Lord. Be with our time. May it be pleasing before you. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right. Well, I'm going to start with a housekeeping note as well tonight. A little bit about timing, because I've had a lot of people ask, how long are we going to be here? What did I commit to? Dodgers game? Yeah. So I'm gonna speak for about 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll have a brief intermission, and then we'll have a panel discussion. Glen Fukumura and Judy Hull and Steve Williams are going to come join me, and they're going to lend some of their wisdom and some of their expertise on some of these topics as well. We'll talk for about another 30 minutes. Then we'll finish with 20 minutes or so of Q&A. That all should get us to about 6:20, or about the 4th inning of the Dodger game, for those of you who are gauging time that way. All right. All right. What did you come to? What are we doing here tonight? Why is the pulpit not up here? This is a pastoral forum, and this is something we're going to try a couple times a year to talk about topics that maybe they could be teaching positions of our church, or maybe they will be at some point in the future. But they're areas that Christians disagree about. It's not an exposition of Scripture. That's why there's no pulpit. It's not a sermon. It's just a way to try to talk through complicated things that maybe our elders or our pastors have noticed that people have a lot of questions about, and that we are going to try to do our best to help you think Christianly about. For most of them, there's no right answer for most of the things we'll talk about tonight, and you have Christian freedom to disagree with what I say about this. Christian freedom just means that we may come to different convictions of what the Scriptures teach or what it means to live under God's authority. So I'm going to do my best to try to talk through some of the things that I think are going to be important for you to think through, but I'm not going to be heavy-handed about this is what I think you need to, where you need to land on it. That's within the realm of Christian freedom. I would also say that there's a lot of grace on this topic as well. I may bring up some examples tonight about topics related to life and death that are going to be, you may come to a different opinion now than you would have 10 years ago, or than your parents did, or than your siblings did over an issue. And you may have some, as Josie mentioned, some feelings you didn't even know were there, where you're really anxious or frustrated or disappointed or angry with something that's happened in the past around death. Maybe a decision that someone else made or that you made in the past. And I want to just set the frame of this is in the frame of grace, right? There's no shame about this. There's no shame about having made a different decision now than you might have made in the past. All right, so that's my preface. Why are we starting these pastoral forums on the topic of death and dying? Of all the debated things in our Christian communities and our churches, why start talking about death and dying? And there's a couple of reasons. One is because it's such a paucity of material to talk about. It's just not something we like talking about in our culture. It's an area of an absence of good information. And I would say pastorally, most people I talk to, either when they're trying to help a loved one through an end-of-life care, or when they're trying to plan a loved one's memorial, the number one phrase I hear is, well, we just never talked about it. We just never talked about it. What were some of her favorite Bible passages that she'd want read at her memorial? Well, we never talked about it. What do you think she would want to have done with her body after she died? Well, we just never talked about it, right? It's just not something we talk about. So I hope one of my goals for tonight is that this will give you enough of a nudge and maybe a little bit of freedom and a little bit of burden to have some of these conversations with your siblings, with your kids, with your friends, with your spouse. You don't have to have every answer, and you can leave tonight saying, I just don't know. I don't know what I would do. And that's okay. But at least to talk about the things that you do know. So that's the first reason. The second reason is the Bible says that we are slaves to the fear of death in our natural selves. Have you ever heard that? It's in Hebrews 2. I put it on your outline that hopefully you got at the door. These two verses are fascinating to me. I gave you the New Living Translation because it's a little bit of a difficult passage to get across, so the paraphrase will hopefully help you. It says, because God's children are human beings made of flesh and blood, the Son also became flesh and blood, for only as a human being could he die, and only by dying could he break the power of the devil, who had the power of death. Only in this way could he set free all who had lived their lives as slaves to the fear of dying. Man, that is a profound passage to me. And Eastern Orthodox theologians have talked about this for a long time, that the devil uses our fear of dying, which is described here as his power over death, in order to provoke us to sin, to provoke us to idolatry, to provoke us to living outside our limits, to provoking us to act as if we'll live forever. And I think one part of responding to that breaking free of the fear of dying is setting our eyes on the cross that we sang about earlier. And another part of it is at least talking about death. Because how are we going to break free from the fear of death if we never talk about death? So that's kind of why we're going in this direction tonight. We'd be naive or foolish to think that this pervasive fear of death doesn't permeate our hearts. Even if as Christians we'd say, I'm not afraid of dying, I have my hope in life and death in Jesus Christ. And that's true. But we live in a culture that is afraid of death as well. And that can shape us. All right. So that's the theology of why we're doing this. I want to address 4 questions or talk about 4 questions with you, and then the panel will talk about them as well, that are going to kind of guide our time tonight. We're talking about end-of-life decisions. We're talking about what to do with your body after you're dead. We're talking about what kind of service you'd want to have happen after you die. And we're going to talk about what do you want your legacy or your passing on of your resources to be after you die. So those are the 4 questions we're going to spend our time on. Let's talk about the first one here. What measures should I take to prolong my life or someone else's? I want to just recognize with you that you guys are in a very difficult position in that modern medicine has given you way more options than human wisdom has had the time to catch up for. Right? Until 100 years ago, we didn't really have to have this discussion. Right? There was no extending life. And so we're going to come to the Bible today with some questions that most of the time, we'll see a couple exceptions here, but most of the time the Bible doesn't address because you didn't intubate people in the first century, right? There's no discussion of, do I want to have a DNR order or not for people in the 4th century BC, right? Feeding tubes, breathing apparatuses. What if I'm brain dead, but you can keep my body alive? Wait, how do I respond to that? Now, I can give you the legal answer. I'm not an attorney, but I'll give you the legal answer. You make your wishes known through an advance directive, or if you're on Medicare, you've probably seen this POLST form that you're given, right? What do you want to have happen in that situation? And it's good to do that, right? It's a gift to your family to let them know your preferences. But it kind of begs a very obvious question, which is, how do I know what my preferences are? Becca and I made a advance directive as part of our will for now that we have kids. And even as a pastor, I really struggled. A pastor and a psychologist were sitting in the office trying to talk through all these different options. And the attorney just said, well, what do you want? I don't know. I don't want to be in that situation. What do you mean? I don't want to die. Right? The challenge is knowing what we want. So let's think about this Christianly together. Does the Christian theology of sanctity of life require you to keep your loved one alive as long as possible? Sometimes you'll hear this sort of bounced around in Christian circles, right? If I believe in the sanctity of life, if I believe a person's made in the image of God, does that mean I have to do everything to keep them alive as long as possible? Maybe some of your families have had debates about this. I know we've had a debate about this in my extended family that caused a big rupture in my extended family over whether that is a sign of love or betrayal based on what you do. And some people carry a tremendous amount of guilt because they didn't do everything they could to keep their loved one alive as long as possible, even if there's no hope for recovery. Conversely, some people feel a tremendous amount of guilt that they did keep their loved one alive, maybe beyond what they would have wanted. This could be life-prolonging measures for someone with no brain activity, or it could be the impossible decision that we'll talk about with the panel in a little bit. Do you have stage 4 pancreatic cancer? Do you go through chemo even if there's no meaningful medical reason to expect recovery, or do you let the cancer take its course? How do you make those kind of decisions? Well, let's think about a few bits of Christian theology here. The first one, and this is where it's the first one for a reason, is that life is sacred because it's made in the image of God, not because it's functional or useful to society. Right? You are not valuable because you have brain activity. You are not valuable because you can do a job. You're not valuable because you're young and lithe and strong. You are valuable because you're made in the image of God, right? So your life is of inestimable value. It is never a waste to spend money, effort, on time on an image bearer of God, right? It is a good thing to keep a person alive, and it is a wicked thing to take life when it is an act of murder. Right? That's what Genesis 9 talks about. Now, that doesn't mean that you are responsible to keep everyone alive as long as possible, but it does mean that we begin the discussion with the sanctity of life. But that's not the only part of the discussion. We also talk about the hope of heaven. Right? The hope of heaven should bear on our hearts throughout our lives. I'm glad that we have kids here, we have high schoolers here, not just at the end of your life, but throughout our lives, it should bear on our hearts. But it should bear especially on our hearts as we near death. That's what Paul talks about in Philippians 1 when he reflects on the idea that he might die. What does he say? To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, which is to be preferred by far, right? It is better to be with God. Maybe some of you have spent time with someone who's nearing death and they've said something like, I just want to go home to be with Jesus. Or I just want to go to heaven. Like I just want to be with Jesus. And sometimes well-meaning family members will say, no, don't say that, don't say that. We're glad you're here. We don't want you to give up. We don't want you to get depressed, right? I understand that sentiment, and there's some understandable wisdom there. But it is not a depressive statement to want to be with God. Right? It is not a depressive statement to want to be with Jesus. As someone gets near death, I do want to make a distinction here, though. Sometimes you hear people say, well, at least they're not suffering anymore. Or I just hope they don't have to suffer. Right? That's good, that's true. I don't want people I love to suffer anymore. But it's an incomplete version of the sentence of, she's not in pain anymore, and she's with Christ forever. That's the hope that should bear on our hearts. Right? The third thing I want to say to help you think through this for your own advanced directives. There is a meaningful distinction between actively prolonging life and killing someone. Right? I'm going to admit here we're in the realm of speculation. It's hard to give chapter and verse on breathing apparatuses for the first century. But can you think of a biblical passage where someone declines life-prolonging treatment when their death was inevitable? You guys think of a biblical passage about this. What's that? Jesus. The right answer is always Jesus, right? It's always Jesus. But Lorraine's right. No, what is Jesus offered on the cross? He's offered sour wine that its purpose was to dull the pain in order to allow him, this is how crucifixion worked, to pull himself up more often on the cross to prolong his life, to make his life longer. And who denies life-extending treatment? Right? Jesus. So if you're going to make the case that you have to take advantage of every opportunity medically to make your life last as long as possible, you have to say Jesus was wrong to do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Now, I do want to make another meaningful distinction, right? It's different There's a distinction here between letting cancer run its course, or letting organ failure run its course, or something of that, a natural end, and then actively ending your life through suicide, physician-assisted or otherwise. I think there's a meaningful distinction there. Now, I don't think the Bible describes suicide as an unforgivable sin. Maybe some of you grew up in a tradition that taught that. But it is still tragedy, right? There's a passage, and it's not Jesus this time, where we see assisted suicide in the Bible. Anyone know that the one time that I could think of, at least, we see assisted suicide in the Bible?
How about Saul?
Saul, yeah, you guys were all ready on that one. That's great, yeah. At the end of Saul's life, there's this tragic scene where he's sure that he's going to die, and so he asks his sword bearer to run him through. Now, the author of Samuel, which incidentally probably isn't Samuel because his death is described in the book, the author of Samuel is describing that scene for a number of reasons, right? One of them is that Saul has spent his whole life worried about what people will think about him, and even in his death, he's worried about what people will think about him. But the other reason it describes it is that right after Saul has someone kill him, his sword bearer kill him, Israelites break through the ranks, save his dead corpse, and bring it back and bury it, with the implication being Saul gave up because he was worried about what people thought about him, even if God's deliverance was at hand.
What happened to the sword bearer?
I'm getting heckled by an elder. Yeah. So I don't say that story of Saul to say as if it's some sort of gotcha passage, right? Euthanasia is a complicated topic, and it's a complicated ethical question. But I would say the Bible does not in any way paint it as a positive option, right? It describes the life being sacred, and the one time we see it described with Saul, the end of Saul's life, it's described as a tragedy. All right, second question. What should I ask my family or my state or my doctor or whomever to do with my body after I die? Now, there's three basic options. There's a lot of sub-options that our culture has provided for us now. Cremation, burial, or donation. Donation being almost always followed by cremation afterwards. Right? So, and then within cremation, there's all kinds of sub-decisions of internment or scattering or something else. Now, we have to acknowledge here, before we talk about how to make this decision, this would have seemed like an absurd discussion to Christians 100 years ago, and it would seem like an unnecessary discussion to most Christians in most parts of the world today. If you were asked Christians in Ghana or Zimbabwe or parts of Latin America or elsewhere, should Christians be cremated or buried, they would say, of course you need to be buried. Of course you need to be buried. Early Christians buried their own, and they buried others who weren't Christians during a plague. It's one of the things that made them stand out compared to the people around them. If you go to Rome, you can visit the catacombs where Christians were buried hundreds of years ago. Even in the midst of persecution, they took great risks to ensure that their dead were buried and not tossed into a corporate grave or burned. If you go to the East Coast today, you can go around and see church graveyards around most of the older churches. A reminder that death and the burial of the body was tied to people's religious activity as Christians. Now, I don't say that to say there's only one right answer. I just want to try to get us out of the tyranny of the present moment, right? Because cremation is right now the most popular option in the United States. It's certainly the most popular option in Southern California, given the cost of burial. And most people expect that it'll increasingly become the most popular option. One study I read this week getting ready for this said that a funeral director said that in the next 10 years, they expect it to be 80% of Americans who die will be cremated. So I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying if you've cremated someone you love that you've done something Christian. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we need to acknowledge this is different than what most Christians around the world and throughout church history have done. So how do we make our decision about what we want to have happen with our bodies? And I do hope you'll make a decision and not leave it on other people to decide for you. Because if you don't know what you want, they're definitely not going to know what you would have wanted. First one, and this is, again, first for a reason, the principle of the resurrection of the dead. If I could be cheeky for one time, I'll say, I'm sure glad Jesus wasn't cremated after the cross, aren't you? I'm sure glad that he was buried so that we could see his resurrected body. And 1 Corinthians 15 says that the resurrection of Jesus' body is the first fruits of what Christians look forward to, that we too will be resurrected from the dead. That's what 1 Corinthians 15 talks about. Whether you practice burial or cremation or something else, I hope that this will be your hope in life and death. It also raises all kinds of questions, though, and anyone who's thought about death for a while would say, yeah, but even if I'm buried, bodies decompose, and they decompose pretty fast, right? Doesn't Ecclesiastes say that we're all going to return to dust? Isn't that the state of all of us, right? Like, unless I happen to die 1 to 2 days before Jesus' resurrection, I'm going to be a decomposed body being raised. Does it really matter if I've been cremated or if I've been buried? Now, that's a good question. That's a good question. The worldview difference here will matter a lot for you, maybe more than the reality of it. Now, I fully believe Jesus is capable of resurrecting our bodies, whether we've been cremated, buried, scattered at sea, returned to the earth. The martyrs who are burned at the stake are not going to be any less raised from the dead than people who are buried in fine coffins. That's certainly true. But how you're buried says a lot about where your hope is and what you're trusting in and what you're looking forward to. All right, the second thing, though, that I think most Christians consider, and I think it is important to consider, is the cost of this choice you're going to make. Costs for burial range a lot, but here in Southern California, if you're going to ask to be buried, you're asking for your estate or your loved ones, or however you want to define it, to spend $40,000 to $50,000 or more, right? It's a lot of money. Cremation, especially if you don't pay for internment, could be less than 10% of that. And if you're going to donate your body to science, either the whole or part of it, you may not have any costs at all. But, just so you know, California state law does forbid you from being paid for your body, so don't plan on that as a life insurance policy. So what do I make of that financial reality? What do I make of that? Now, I'm a pretty frugal person, so, I'm thinking about the money, but I hope that this is not the primary decision-making thing for you. But I would certainly respect if one of you said, look, I don't come from a wealthy family. I don't have a lot of resources. I want to leave an inheritance to my kids or my grandkids, or I don't want to make them pay for me to be buried. I'd like to be cremated just so that they have something to live on. I can certainly respect that, the stewardship of that. And I think that we should bear that in mind as we think about what would have happened with our bodies after we die. And then, I mostly talk about cremation and burial. It is worth thinking about donation, especially organ or tissue donation. If you're not registered as an organ donor or a tissue donor, I hope you'll consider that and doing that next time you either register for your driver's license or other ways. Donation can be partnered with burial if that's a solution you want to make. And it's a great way to love your neighbor as yourself. All right, we'll talk more about some of these options with the panel in a little bit. Number 3, this is probably the area that I'm most experienced with talking about. What kind of memorial service or funeral do I want people to have for me after I'm gone? And this is where you can be really helpful to your family. A funeral, it means the body is there. Memorial means the body is not there. That's the distinction between a funeral and a memorial. It's become increasingly popular in recent years to call these a celebration of life instead of a memorial or a funeral. I think the reason is that most families and most people who talk about it ahead of time don't want people to be sad after they die. Most of the times when I meet with families as they are planning a memorial, they say some form of, we just don't want it to be very sad. We just don't want it to be sad. And when I was a young pastor, I believed them. And I said, this is going to be fun. We're going to come. It's not going to be sad. They didn't want it to be sad. And then a grown man in his 50s started bawling the moment I started the service. And I was totally unprepared. I was like, he doesn't want to be sad because he's sad his mom died. But it is sad, right? Calling it a celebration of life doesn't solve the fact that this is sad, and it should be sad. Right? So if you want to call it a celebration of life, that's fine. We can print bulletins here that say celebration of life. But it's not going to solve this reality that it's a sad time. So how do you decide what kind of service you want or what you want the service to include? I'll just point out another change. No judgment here, but just a change. If I were to look at pastoral manuals from my grandfather's generation, from maybe pre-World War II, they would say the memorial service is a God-centered service where we talk about our hope of the resurrection of Jesus Christ and maybe we name the person a couple times, right? That was 70 years ago. Now, the memorial service will maybe mention God a couple times, and it'll be all about the person who has died, right? The whole purpose of getting together is to talk about that person's life instead of God. Do you see the big distinction, the big difference we're making there? Right? So again, I'm not saying the old way was better. That's not my point. Just to say we've changed a lot. We need to recognize that. And we need to recognize it because we need to think about what's going to actually help in the grief process, what's going to help people moving forward. As you plan your service, or you think about parts you want to include in your service, I would encourage you to think not how can I stop people from grieving, but how can I help them to grieve well? Because it's not going to help anyone for someone to get up and read a poem that says, "Do not cry for me, I am with the flowers," or whatever. Because people should cry, right? Death is a heinous tragedy that doesn't reflect what God intended for us as people. And it's not going to help them to repress their grief if they're having it. All right, so what would help others in their grief process? The other thing I'd encourage you to think about, what do I consider the parts of my life that I would most want to pass on to others? As I've watched families work through memorials, one of the things that saddens me is how superficial and banal most people's remembrances are of their grandparents, of their even their parents sometimes. It's like people get up to do a eulogy and they say, well, it's so great that me and Cousin Joe went camping 10 years ago. I'll always remember when he fried, the eggs, and that was really nice, and I'll miss those eggs. Just think that's what you're taking away from someone else's life, right? So I would encourage you to think about, what do you actually want people to take away from your life? What do you want them to remember? Here I gave you on the sheet a few things to think about. Who do you want to be there? Who do you want to be there? Who would you want to speak or sing on your behalf? What are your favorite hymns or songs? Otherwise, we'll just sing Amazing Grace, and that's fine. We sing Amazing Grace every memorial. Chris is great at it. But if you have a favorite hymn or song, I'd encourage you to write that down and let people know. What are some of your favorite Bible passages? It can be Psalm 23. It can be 1 Corinthians 15. Those are the most common ones we speak at memorials, or John 14. But if there's something that's really dear to you, it's going to help. It's going to help me. It's going to help your family. Really personalize what happens at your service. What are some of the moments in your life that were most important to you, that really shaped you, that you really want people to remember about for you? Now, I'm speaking as if I'm going to do your service. You don't have to have a pastor there. There's no such thing as a Christian burial that has bearing on your soul before God. There are other traditions that might teach that, but that's not our teaching. That's not the church's, the Bible's description. A Christian burial doesn't mean, in my opinion, anything. I think it can be helpful. I'm happy to do your service. I would like to. That's an honor. It's a great thing to talk about the gospel, but it doesn't bear any bearing on your soul. All right, last thing before we get the panel up here. What do I want to have happen to my stuff after I'm gone? What do I want to have happen to my stuff after I'm gone? This is another one where there's a legal answer to this, right? You make a living trust, or you make a will, and you distribute your resources, right? You hire an attorney, and they make sure that you're passing on your home, your finances, whatever, to the people that you want to pass them on to. But that doesn't answer the moral question of, how do I know who that should be? Right? Do I leave everything equally? What if I don't have kids? What if I'm in a blended family? Do I have to leave things to my kids and to my spouse? And do I split it? How do I decide about that? What if there's been a falling out with members of my family? What if I think some of my kids are knuckleheads and they're going to waste it? How do I... This struck close to home. How do I decide that? Because an attorney can do that for you, but they can't tell you what you should do. So again, and I can't tell you what you should do, but I can help you think about the scriptures together a little bit. First thing I would say, leave inheritances like God. The Bible talks a lot about Israel receiving the land as an inheritance from God. And so, we don't talk a lot about the book of Leviticus. We don't talk a lot about the passing out of the land to Israel, though it's repeatedly described as an inheritance from God for Israel. And it's meant to be distributed evenly among the tribes. And there are all these laws in place to make sure that Israel holds on to the land, even when people do foolish things over time, that they're to redistribute the land through the process of Jubilee to make sure that the people always have their inheritance. In the New Testament, we also see a lot of language about inheritance, don't we? We're described as heirs of God, right? All of us, male and female, are described as sons of God, heirs of God, to receiving the inheritance that comes from God. God's extravagantly generous with us. Probably the most famous passage about inheritance in the New Testament is the parable of the prodigal son, right? And we see there that the inheritance is meant to be a picture of the father's prodigal, which means almost wasteful or extravagant love on his wasteful or extravagant son. And so I'd say my first piece of advice to you would be consider carefully how the Bible describes God and his act of leaving an inheritance to his people. It's a good and godly thing to do. In fact, Proverbs says that a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but a sinner's wealth is laid up for the righteous. It's a good thing to leave an inheritance. But Proverbs also says that mercy should be the limit to mercy in this case. It says that it's not always wise to leave an inheritance to fools. This is what Proverbs 20, verse 21 says. An inheritance gained hastily in the beginning will not be blessed in the end. Inheritance gained hastily in the beginning will not be blessed in the end. So you would do a wise thing to make sure that you're not leaving inheritances hastily, to leaving inheritances that will cause your loved ones to stumble because you're giving them more resources than they have the means to deal with, or than they've shown the capacity to deal with. So you can stagger an inheritance. They get a part when they're 18, a part when they're 25, a part when they're 30, a part when they're 40, if you really think they're going to take a long time to mature, to make sure that you're understanding the spirit of Proverbs 20. Now, you probably know that in the Bible, inheritances were typically left to the oldest male at a 2/3 rate, and the second-born male at a 1/3 rate, and the daughters usually got very little, right? Maybe a dowry. That's never described in glowing terms in the Bible. It's just sort of narrated as something that happened, but it's not meant to be prescriptive. I would say for my family, we planned it out that our 3 kids would get equal inheritance, though there's always a chance that, one of them can rise to the top. No, I'm just joking. I'm just joking. Just joking. But, I think there's also the reality of you don't have to limit it to your biological children. You could also think about causes you care about. You can think about other extended members of your family. And certainly in the church, there's a reason to think that only our biological kids are not the only people that should benefit from us. We're the family of God, and you can care for others as well as those that you come from, or that come from you biologically. I would say, though, be proactive, right? Don't abdicate responsibility for this to the probate courts. First of all, the probate court is not going to do exactly what you would want it to do if you don't leave a living trust or a will. And secondly, you're going to end up wasting time and money for your heirs as a result. All right. I think that we've gone longer than I expected there. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a 3-minute break. Josie got some coffee and some snacks in the back. We're going to reset up here a little bit with our panel, and then they are going to give you better counsel on some of these topics. All right. So we'll start back up in 3 to 4 minutes. How is the game going? All right. Well, please feel free to find a seat. Well, as part of these pastoral forums, I'm excited for you guys to hear from some other wise voices in our church on some of these topics and how they wrestle through them. Judy wanted us to have like a come on down moment, so here comes Judy too. Yeah. So I'm sure you know a lot of these people that are up front, but just quick word of introduction of why I asked him to be on this panel. Tomorrow it's Glen Fukumura. He is an elder of our church and a pediatrician by profession, and has walked through this, I know, with some people in your family as well as professionally, and so I'm excited to have Glen share a little bit with us.
Well, is it on? Can you hear me all right?
There you go.
So I am a pediatrician in Long Beach. I've been doing it a pretty long time. Different sections in my life dealing with death and dying. During my training, certainly a large portion in the ICUs, both the neonatal ICU and the pediatric ICU, and more tragedy than I think I ever wanted to see in a lifetime. Different, though, than when we talk about end of life, because it's end of life for lives that didn't get started very far. So certainly a very different mindset as far as preparing for that, because there's no preparation. And then during my career, I was outpatient pediatrician, but still several patients passed either from tragedy, from car accident, or cancers, and a few from tragedies from chromosomal issues, or one family that had twins that had no brain, but she carried the whole time. So I've had some experience with doing some home visits for end-of-life care for children, which is again different because there's no preparation, or a very short amount of preparation. So that's my professional life. Personal life, both my parents lived a very long, very late in life, and both went through hospice care, which was, for us, a beautiful experience. They weren't taken quickly, but we were able to say goodbye to them. And then my mother-in-law, who died very quickly from complications of heart problems. So we were in the hospital in the ICU and letting her go very quickly and not having near the preparation for that. And then an uncle who I walked through stem cell transplant, which is difficult. And I was the only one down in the LA area, so I spent a lot of time with him, and he was not Christian. And we had conversations, but he ended up passing after stem cell transplant, but I never knew where his heart was. And there's the hope, but you don't know. Yeah. So there's a lot of preparation that goes in, and all of us have different experiences from different phases in our life. So that's me.
Thanks, Glenn. And this young man to the right here, Reverend Dr. Steve Williams, yeah? If you guys don't know Steve, he was
Glenn has been a pediatrician for a while. He's took care of our kids who are now in their 40s, so. And he was a great doctor for them, so we're thankful for Glenn. I think tonight I'm bringing a couple different perspectives. One personal from my own experiences, and then professionally as a pastor, having to do a lot of memorials and funerals and things like that, and hospital calls and so forth. So just briefly, things that I've experienced. My first real encounter with death was when I was a junior higher, and my grandparents were hit by a drunk driver as they were crossing the street, and both killed. And so I was very close to my grandmother, and so I was devastated. And then a few years later, I had an uncle that was killed He was a clerk in a store, and he was taken in the back by somebody and killed when they robbed the store. So a couple of really tragic events that shaped my early life in terms of my experience with death. But besides that, I mean, I kind of seen it from all different angles. I've seen, I had, my father died from Alzheimer's at 88, but my mother died from cancer, pancreatic cancer, at 63. Her death was something I wish I never saw. It was a pretty traumatic experience for me. I've also been in places where the person who passed had the most peaceful, wonderful, blessed passing I could ever experience, and I just hope and pray that when I die like that. So, so I have some perspectives to bring on services and that kind of stuff. So, Judy.
Hi, can you hear me? My name is Judy Hull. My background is a marriage, family, child counselor. And then I received my own life-threatening kind of diagnosis many years ago. And I ended up at this church, and I went through Stephen Ministry with Steve. And then I became certified as a chaplain, where I've spent over 19 years, I guess, at UCI Medical Center, working on the palliative team, working mainly with cancer patients, and I just felt like it was a way God used all the things that I was going through, and it really meant a lot to me, and also this church meant a lot to me. So, so that's my story.
Yeah, thanks, Judy. Well, as you guys, let's start with end-of-life decisions. As you all shared some of your experiences with this. What do you wish people did more to prepare? Practical, but also emotional, spiritual. What do you wish people would do more to prepare for these end-of-life decisions?
Anybody want to go first? Well,
Can you repeat that question? So are you going on this list, or are you doing?
I think I'm going on the same list I
Yeah.
sent you guys ahead of time.
second question.
Unless I gave you a different question.
Well, I think as far as preparation, it's for me, it's communicating. Communicating with your family, with your parents, with your spouse, what you would want to have happen. I mean, the most important thing all of us can do is have our relationship with Jesus in the right place. And the closer we are with Jesus, we're preparing ourselves, and we're in our families seeing our life and preparing and knowing what we think. But not talking about what happens when we pass is a disservice to the ones you love. I mean, for my family growing up, my father would always talk about it. He'd say, Janet, I'm just going to be working, and I just want to have a heart attack and go, and that'll be it. And if it happens, tomorrow, it's fine. And my mom was like, Tom, don't talk about it. Don't say it. Don't speak it into existence. And so, my father would talk about it, but my mom really didn't want to talk about it. But as they grew older, they were more receptive to it, and really let my sister and I know what their wishes were. But it's different. My sister and I communicated very well, and it was a very small family. But a lot of people have very large families, split families, second families, and when you have family members who are disengaged from the family, it's hard to communicate that. And so I feel very fortunate that I was able to have a family situation where communication was really good. But in my practice, I've seen, horrible communication between, split families, divorced families that don't speak to their kids, teenagers that don't know what's going on with their parents, and it's a tragedy, because when one parent passes, which I've seen, then there's this grieving process that doesn't happen, because there's so much dysfunction with the family. But communications, letting your family know what you want, writing it down, which I think Steve's going to talk about, is so important. And so I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, I just echo what Glenn said. You need to talk about it as a family ahead of time, but also make sure that your wishes are written down somewhere so that someone else can read it, and do it while you can. Because I just watched my father die from Alzheimer's, and by the time, he couldn't tell me anything about what he wanted, and his memorial service was, it was very painful because there were family issues that weren't solved, religious differences. He had remarried after my mom passed, and so it was a really awkward service because he didn't ever express what he wanted, and so we were all guessing, and then everybody's and it's a free for all who gets what they want in the service. So that's kind of that was hard. So write it down, do it while you can, and find a way to share your beliefs too. I know we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but you may be in the hospital and you may have some relatives or people who don't want the chaplain to come in because your person that's visiting is not a believer, and yet you want the chaplain to be there, and you want a pastor to come in. And so if that's what you want, make sure you let people know that's not what you want. So, Judy.
Yes, I've probably ministered to over 100 people dying in the hospital, and I just, the advance directive, we're just going to say it over and over again. And if anybody wants any help with filling that out, I've done it before. Don't wait till you get in the hospital, though. When you're on medication and you're depressed and your family's in crisis, we just can't say enough about having that done. Preparation. I think, how do you prepare someone emotionally for this? And to me, it's just create opportunities for your family to talk. Don't be afraid of the conversation. Gently bring up, if they're not talking about it and they don't, they're sick and you haven't had the discussion, bring your family together and just ask gentle questions like, what do you think you would want? Or tell me the things that would help you get through this. Open up the conversation. It's a hard conversation to have. People at this time, sometimes there is so much dysfunction as far as family members coming into the hospital. I have been in situations where there was no advance directive, and the family is fighting over what is going to happen to their loved one who can no longer answer. And I would know many times what they wanted, but they will not obey those decisions. If there's no DNR, whether that person wanted to be resuscitated, they will be resuscitated. So I just can't say it enough. I know it's a hard thing to do. Spiritually, just like Steve was saying, I have visited a patient in the hospital for maybe months, and then they're dying, and the family will all come in, and there might be a sister or someone who's not a Christian, and they will tell me not to come in, knowing that I knew that person wanted to see me. And so put those wishes down. Let your family know your strong beliefs. Let them know how important it is to you. Don't worry about offending, that non-Christian family member.
Well, let's talk about Christian faith here, Judy, and we don't have to go Glenn, Steve, Judy every time. We can go through the I'm not saying you have to go first, Judy. I just want to. I just really value your opinion. In addition to the emotional comfort it provides us in our heart, how do you think our Christian faith should help us make different decisions about dying than if we weren't Christians?
I like what you said. I think it gets back to the intention thing that Christians,
They want to hear you on the live stream,
Christians-
so you got to have the mic, yeah.
Christians don't want to, they think they should extend life, and that somehow that might be a sin, or I wasn't even sure about that answer. Should we keep going with treatment? Someone talked my elderly mother, who was going in for a heart valve, and she was 93, was she 93 yet? And she had a heart thing while she was having the test. And they went in and put the heart valve on. Anyway, and she suffered horribly, at 93 years old. And it was just so hard to watch. But I've seen so many of those situations of life is precious, and we get confused about how to deal with that.
Yeah, thanks, Judy.
I mean, I think maybe one of the things that would make a difference would be just your testimony and how you would interact with the staff. As a believer, we have a hope. We have a great hope for the future. And so in spite of all of the suffering, we're looking forward to something better. So decisions we make would be like how we talk to our family and deal with physicians and making plans. So that's what I'd say the main difference. And planning, because a lot of people don't plan. And then also just as Bob, I appreciate the fact that you gave some background about burial versus cremation. And it is true, that in years gone by, there was this emphasis on teaching through the funeral that there was hope in a bodily resurrection. And some of that seems to have been lost in the way we've gone. So, again, that's a personal decision.
What are as far as extending life, it's going to be personal to each person, but you have to look at what your purpose is, what God has for you as you extend your life. My father was 92 when he was diagnosed with chronic kidney failure. And he was given a choice to, your kidney's going to fail, you're going to pass. Or do you want to have dialysis? Do you want to, and that's going to be tough on someone who's 92. And we talked about it as a family. And he felt like he still had a purpose, that he was willing to go through that until it wouldn't work anymore. And we had a terrific nephrologist who just walked us through that decision, and my sister and I and my mother. And my father said, I still want to live. I have a purpose in God's kingdom. And so he started dialysis. He started a new Bible study in his church at 92, even though he couldn't hear very well, which was crazy. And he was on dialysis for 4.5 years. And at that point, he said, it's enough. I'm ready to go. He made it to his first grandson's wedding, and we stopped dialysis, and a month later he was gone. But he had a reason to extend his life. And if you're just extending it to hang on for a month, 2 months, and you have no real reason except you fear death, and that's that slavery to the fear of death you talked about, then you have to, as a family, talk through that.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to the second part here. We talked about the process of dying. Let's talk about the body. Right? What would you say to someone who said, I just don't care what happens to my body after I die. Let someone else figure it out. I'll be in heaven with Jesus, and I'm not worried about it. Just throw me in a ditch.
Well, people do say that.
People do say that.
I mean,
that's a
there are
quote
lot of
from
people
someone in my
who've had that
family.
attitude. I think part of it is because they don't really want to just deal with it. It's just easier to not think about it because it's so painful, and just put it off till another time or let somebody else try to figure it out. So what would I say about that? Well, first of all, I think you're being very selfish. You're just thinking about your own needs. Because when you think about it, when I help people in planning the memorials or funerals, here's a family that is having to make all these decisions and grieve at the same time. It's really hard. And when you're grieving, you don't want to be making those kinds of decisions. The times when I had close relatives die, the last thing I wanted to do was think about details about how things should be done in a service. So you're really being self-centered by saying let somebody else do it. And really, you're actually, and we're stewards. I like the idea that we are stewards of everything, not just our finances, but we're stewards of our body, which means we need to take care of ourselves, but also we need to think about what's going to happen to our body when we go to be with the Lord, because we're stewards of our body. So that's part of that, I think, is important.
Okay. And remember, I'm mostly in the hospital, so it can be a different situation. If I had someone, and I have had many say that, normally, yes, I would love to right off the back say that's an act of love for your. It's not about you; it's about your family. But on the other hand, hopefully, I have an opportunity to talk to that person. There's usually something underneath that. There's a family that they're afraid not going to come. There's family problems. There's a sister that they never talked to in the last 20 years. There's just so many other reasons. And many times, if you just kind of lend a gentle ear to those people, it'll come out, and hopefully you can kind of change their mind on that and help them write. I will sit there, write it down for them, myself. Anyway.
I don't know if I have anything else to add, except we went through this with my aunt, who is now in a home with dementia, but before she started losing some of her capacities, my sister and I were trying to convince her to leave a will, a simple will, and she was just like, I don't care, I'm going to be gone anyway. You and Jennifer can decide what to do with my stuff. And we're like, no, please. So we begged her, and she finally consented. But there are a number of people who don't really care. And my aunt's not Christian either, and so she didn't have the hope of heaven, and we've talked to her a lot, but she just was like, well, I'm just going to be gone, and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. I'm gonna skip over a couple because we're running a little later than I had hoped for. Let's jump down to number 6. You've all been to a lot of memorials, celebration of life, funerals, maybe other terms you've heard used. What's the most God-honoring thing you've seen done at one of those? And then we'll talk about the other side here in a second.
Oh, I think I should pass it to Steve.
Or most beautiful thing.
Okay, I think for me is, especially when I was going through my situation, I was a brand new Christian. And for me, sometimes I go to a funeral, if it was God-centered, and I could see, oh, there we go. I could be inspired to do better. I could be inspired by how that person overcame so much. Mm-hmm. And it ended up more, yes, I honored that person, but I walked away with a gift also.
I just kind of want to echo what you said, Bob, about the difference in currently the way a lot of memorials are handled and stuff being a celebration of life. And I understand that, and I think it's good to honor a person. I mean, we need to do that. But to me, the thing that's most helpful is when the service is really oriented around a message of hope, singing the great Christian hymns that bring us hope, and just worshiping, rather than just focusing on this person. And let's see, cringiest stuff.
I was
I've
with
seen-
you at one where a guy took a shot off the
One,
casket.
yeah,
so
it's
I
hard
don't,
to pick.
I don't know if that makes the list.
Well, probably the weirdest one was when we had someone come up and bring a flask. We asked him to speak, about their friend, and they came up to the front and they pulled out a flask and offered a toast to this buddy, just in their drinking buddy. It's like, because he really liked fine whiskey, and I mean, it was just, I didn't know what to say. It was just, it was really strange. But could I say a funny one too?
Sure.
I mean, I know we're gonna-
I mean, that one wasn't far off.
We had a lady who was in her late 80s when she died. When I did her service in the chapel, and she was such a joker. Like she said on her 80th birthday, she was at a relative's house that had a pool, and she said to them, "Aren't you going to throw me in the pool?" And they said, "Grandma, we're not going to throw you in the pool." So she just jumped in. That's the kind of lady she was. So anyway, in the middle of her funeral service or memorial, the fire department had the volunteer horns. You guys remember the horns? I guess they don't do it anymore. But in the middle of her service, the horns went off. It was just crazy. It was zany.
Let's see. There was a service, a little cringy and very memorable. My ex-pastor, who married Liz and I, gentleman, Reverend Takaya, at his funeral service, he was super organized. And so he followed every step of what we've talked about tonight. He had a service planned out. He had the program made. He had everybody who he wanted to talk and what he wanted them to say. And I was very impressed. I'm like, wow, is this an example of what we should be doing? Which I guess it sort of is. But he also had a video, and it was about 5 minutes. And it was a little, I wasn't quite sure how to take it because it was his a little bit younger self talking to us. And really it was a God-centered talk. But I don't think for my family I'm going to leave a video talking to them. But I would like Be Thou My Vision and I'll Fly Away played at my wedding.
All right.
Or my funeral. Not at my wedding. Not at my wedding. So write it down.
I'm not sure I'll Fly Away is the right message for a wedding.
Yeah. Right. I'll Fly Away is better for a funeral.
Yeah.
I guess the saddest thing for me is having gone to some non-God-centered funerals that have put the person on a pedestal, and the talk is how much that person meant, but more for the person who was talking getting something from or acknowledgement from that other person, and just putting a person on a pedestal and not making it about what God is doing in their life or in the world. And so that for me, maybe not the cringiest, but sad for me.
Yeah. Well, I talked a little bit about the various options that are out there for people's bodies after they die, cremation and burial and all that. Is there anything that you think people should know about those different options that you'd want them to consider? Wisdom you'd have for that?
I don't know. For me, Liz and I have talked, and all my family's been cremated, or a number of my family's been cremated, and I've just thought that's the decision I was going to make. I don't know. I don't know that there's a right answer to that.
Sure.
So.
Yeah.
Can I dive in as number 7 just for a minute?
Sure.
Okay.
So number 7 is, Steve, this question's mostly for you. There you go. What do you think the most helpful thing someone can do to help their family prepare for their memorial service?
So when I first read this, I made my list, and then I read it again, and it said the most helpful. So I was like, oh, which one is the most helpful? So I narrowed it down to 2, okay? Because I think but really, the stuff people don't really think about. One is write your biography, a 1-page sort of, or maybe 2-page, history of your life, right, ahead of time. Because inevitably, the pastor will come and ask the family, we're going to talk about this person. First of all, the pastor may not know the person, so they're trying to get information to make the service more meaningful, but you're having to piece together this person's life. So write it out ahead of time, 1 or 2 pages at the most, brief synopsis of your life, what's important to you, what's favorite Bible verse, how you came to know Christ, whatever's really important to you, write it down in there and have it ahead of time. So you don't have to do that. Your family's not scrambling around trying to figure out your family, your history, in order to make the pastor happy. Okay? I mean, that's basically what it comes down to.
Yeah, we'd really appreciate that.
Yeah. No, really, I'm serious. Just write it out. And the other thing is, and this is really, really, and Bob will probably back me up on this, is really important. If you have someone going to speak at your service, ask the people ahead of time, the ones who are going to speak, or designate them and make the pastor know, okay, Aunt Lily's going to talk, and so is going to talk, and brother so and so. But have it picked out ahead of time, right? Because two weird things can happen in services. One, and this might be the really cringiest thing, is pastor gets up and he says, "Now, who would like to stand up and say something about the dearly beloved past person?" And no one says anything, and you stand there, your eyes get big, like nobody's going to say anything about this person, and that's super, super awkward. And then the other one is, I had this lady who was probably in her late 80s anyway. She stood up in a service that we did, and she started talking about the person that died, and she went on for like 15 minutes, and no one would grab her arm and say, "Please, you're done." We're all trying to be polite, but it went on and on and on. So don't do that.
Yeah, don't. All right. Last question for me. How does your faith shape how you plan to leave an inheritance or distribute your estate after you're gone? How does your faith shape that decision you're going to make? I don't know why they made you go first, Judy, but I guess.
That's probably not my best question. Well, we usually would have I guess my faith would say that I would equally give to all our daughters, and hopefully some kind of organization in the church.
This wasn't a leading question. I just thought it was.
That's where we are with that.
Yeah, definitely have a living trust and put everything in it, and then make sure. And we haven't really done this much, but really sit down with your family and go through it, at least the highlights, because some of them look like old Sears catalog. But just make sure that they know what your wishes are, and you put it in there. And then, if you want certain gifts to go to certain places, write it down, put it, so that people know what your thoughts are. But the greatest piece of wisdom I ever heard on this came from Rick Warren, and I will quote him. I don't remember when he said it, but I've never forgotten it. But to me, it was just a simple, homey little saying, and he said, "Do your giving while you're living, then you'll be knowing where it's going." I just thought that was brilliant. So anyway.
That sounds like Rick Warren, yeah.
I guess Liz and I had made our living trust a while ago, and talked about family and who should get what. But the Elder Board's been going through a book called Generous Justice by Tim Keller this year, and talking about the importance of the importance of taking care of the vulnerable, the Bible speaks of taking care of the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, the poor. And so we've been looking at that, and it's affected what I think as far as what you leave and the example you set to your family, especially for if you're blessed with having children, the example you can set to your children about how you give currently and what you would choose for them to carry on. Not necessarily that they give to the same charities or the same causes, but that they make their own decisions about what to do with some of the inheritance that's coming, and also for yourself to look at what you would want to do in serving what God has called us to is to take care of the vulnerable.
Yeah, great.
Can I add one thing about our church? Because it's
My
pertinent.
last question was going to be any final insights you have, so here we go.
Here's my final thing. Years ago, there was a member of our church who named the church as a beneficiary of their life insurance policy with the stipulation that the money that this church received would go into a fund to help support short-term missions. And so that fund has, the person's ministry has been multiplied for decades, because there are people here in leadership of this church now who participated in some of those short-term missions, and that was helpful in the formation of their spiritual walk. And so I'm not saying that because I want you to do that. I'm just saying that by thinking ahead and making a plan like that, your life can count for decades in ways that you can't even imagine. It's really a good thing.
Any other final insights you guys may have? All right. Well, we're going to have about, 10 minutes left to do some Q&A with the audience, and Josie's got a microphone. She's offered to run around and get her steps in. So if you have any questions you are hoping that Glenn, Steve, or Judy would answer and that I would make a joke about, now is the time to ask them. All right. Thanks, Lorraine.
These Bruins, oh Lord. Okay, I have a question. I don't know if it's really answerable at the moment, but I'm interested to learn more about foundations and anybody who knows a little bit more about that. So,
Are you talking about how to establish a foundation, or?
yes,
Okay.
all.
Okay.
I don't.
I asked a
it's
clarifying
not, I don't
question,
need,
but it doesn't help. I don't know anything about foundations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nor
I don't know
do
how
I.
to use foundation. I don't know how
Great.
foundation.
You have my email.
Are you talking about a charitable foundation?
Well, I'm going into taxes. Maybe somebody else should take the mic. But yes, I am interested to learn more about that and what you can establish that will help others more than just some sort of fund specific to XYZ blah. So.
John's probably the guy to answer that one more than I am. Yeah. Well, you're the attorney, not me.
Well, speaking of attorneys, there's a former Brethren attorney in Long Beach on Willow. I've referred several people to his name. Can I use his name? He does.
Sure. I don't know who you're talking
he's
about.
Brethren, so you got to go with that. John T. Anderson, and he does all kinds of probate stuff, and he's very expert in that. Sure. He's a godly man. He's also a karate black belt, but that's neither here nor there. What do you do with the DNR, though? That's a question I've never had adequately answered. Judy Hull's got one.
You have a copy. Again, when you do your advanced directives, I also say give copies. Give copies to everyone, but that should be in your that'll be in your advanced directive somewhere. Yeah. And the hospital will have it on your door.
Yeah, you want a cardiac arrest, though, the firefighters.
You want it, you're right, you want it, because they will, you're right. You have to have it on your, what your son?
Well, some people say, well, put it in the refrigerator and freezer, or some people say put it on the refrigerator. But
Yeah, not in the refrigerator, on the refrigerator. Yeah. Yeah, somewhere publicly visible. Yeah. And you're saying in the hospital, you can have it in your medical file.
That's my experience. Yeah. But I've heard also when you're home.
Yeah, we've talked about writing things down. You also have to let people know where it is that you wrote it down. If you have an advance directive, your kids or whoever, they need to know where you put it and not have to, search your house to find one piece of paper.
I just had a quick question along that lines. So we had a living trust done, and we have DNRs set up in our living trust, but we don't have any other copy of it other than it's in the living trust. So should we then make copies of that and stick it on the refrigerator, give it to our doctor and all of that?
I would again, talking with your family, we actually sat down with a few of ours and just showed them where everything was, and it was kind of uncomfortable, but I think they walked away feeling relieved. Just let everybody know what you want before it's too late. I have a little joke. My grandson, while I was writing this, Ollie, in the back seat of my car says, "Nana, you're 80. Does that mean you're going to die soon?"
Gotta love grandkids.
Don't keep your children. Please talk to your children too. Don't put them in a room and talk to them about what things are going on too. That's really hard in the hospital when the kids are just sitting in the waiting room and are worried. But anyway.
Henry, do you have another question? Do you have a question there?
Yeah, I have a comment, one or two things. I happen to be very familiar with organ transplantation and to some extent with organ donation. I wanted to just add something. One of the things that's happened, you mentioned the DMV, which has been a very good place to go because you can do it when you deal with driver's license stuff. It has to be an online list. And that online list, once you put your name into it, nobody's going to be able to pull your name out. But the other thing is, because this whole deal with dealing with organ donation is voluntary, you could take your name off that list anytime, as far as I know, anytime you wish to do. You have a choice to leave it in, not leave it in, whatever you're going to do, and nobody's going to be able to tell you you can't. So that's a real important thing about organ donation. If you're more interested in stuff like that, I'd suggest contacting online One Legacy. They're handling a lot of stuff with organ donation in Southern California. Thanks.
Thanks, Henry. David, do you have a question?
Yeah, I did.
Or comment? Yeah.
Just wondering, in terms of the serious nature of talking with family, them talking with you, just hearing how communication is so vital, what would be some practical steps to make it a little bit easier for family members who don't want to initiate that, but how to make it more both ways?
That's a good question. So you're saying as the one who, maybe, to use a stereotype, you're going to talk to an older relative and they don't want to talk about it. How do you help them sort of open up about some of these things? Is that kind of
That's more of what I had in mind, but
Yeah.
I figured it could go both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just order pizza. No, I'm kidding, but there's always, around the table, get some food, and then if people are not comfortable, just let them know. If you're not comfortable, you don't need to come and talk, but we really need to talk about this. And probably the people that are the ones that would be the most decision makers and need to know people, they'd probably say, yeah, okay, I want to talk about it. That's my hunch. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Every family's different. So, yeah, get some food.
Yeah, I think Steve's right. I mean, you have to be in a comfortable position, and you have to be vulnerable and let them know, what you're thinking about yourself. And when you have questions about, I'm not sure what to do, and you're asking advice, because people are more apt to open up if they see you're vulnerable and really want to engage. But you have to be willing to say what you're thinking too, and not just your older relative. Well, I need to know what you want. When they'd want to know what what you would want if you were in the hospital or if you were at end of life. So I think that's how you open up some of those conversations.
Yeah, that's good counsel. Maybe one more question, Annalise? I like that you guys are making Josie run across the room. I like that.
My question is, have you seen someone witness well for Christ as they were dying? And if so, what did that look like?
Have you seen someone witness well for Christ while they're dying?
While they're dying, definitely, I don't know how to put it into words, but it's very hard to say. You can just tell that someone who has a really strong faith, that they will be in prayer, and sometimes, and also, I don't know, in the last stages of dying, it's like people become more, it's like they're going to God, and there's like everybody else they're not listening to anymore. It's kind of amazing. And a lot of people are offended by that. I mean, like, oh, mom's going and she's not talking to me, but I just feel like they're in communication with God and they're ready to go. I don't know if that explains it very well. So it can be beautiful.
Yeah. I think that's probably a good way to end. Unless you guys have something you want to wrap up. All right. Glenn, would you be willing to pray for us as we close our time?
Sure. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you tonight to just open conversations among family, to know what we would want as we get near to you, as we prepare to pass from this earthly body, Lord. And just that we would be compassionate with others in our family who are struggling, family members who don't know you, and that each of us would take the responsibility to serve you well, to show our family the importance of a relationship with you. And we just thank you for your son Jesus that set the example for us both in how to live and how to die, and to be able to speak the truth to those closest to us. So we pray that this would just be a starting point to help each of us have conversations with our family and be open and to prepare, to be compassionate to those we leave behind by preparing so they don't have to make decisions for us after we leave. We give all honor to you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, as we close, we are going to sing Amazing Grace. And I'm going to ask you guys to stand. And, talking about death can be a little isolating. So I'm going to ask, actually, it's a little unusual, but if you'd be willing to hold the hands of the people near you as we sing this hymn together.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieve. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. The Lord has promised good to me. has promised good to me. His word I hope secures. He will portion be as long as life endure. When we've been there 10,000 years, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun.
Thanks for joining us. I'll hang out and talk as long as you guys want.